Welcome to Health, Wealth, and Legacy. I'm your host, Sam Abdallah. Our goal is to bring leaders, thought leaders, education to inspire, empower, and motivate you to expand your mindset, grow, and live your best possible life in the areas of health, wealth, financial freedom, and legacy. All right, welcome everybody to our show here. So I'm here with Rachel Oliver from Clover Properties. She's part owner of Clover Properties. And they've been helping Ontario families get on the path to homeownership through proven rent to own process. Family owned and operated company, helping over 600 families stop renting and start owning. And it's ideal for a lot of people. She's going to talk about that today and their mission. So welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Sam, for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what got you into your story about how you got into rent to own and what some of your missions are at Clover Properties.
Well, originally it all goes back to my why. I think my why was the key driver that I really wanted to make different choices in my life. I didn't want to exchange my time for the benefit of my boss achieving his revenue targets and his overall, achievement for his lifestyle. And I really thought, I'm working super hard. I'm climbing this corporate ladder, usually 45 to 60 hours a week in some cases, at the expense of not being there with my family, asking for raises, asking for time off. And I just thought, life is too short. And sure enough, I got diagnosed with breast cancer when I was just 35 years old.
Wow. So that
And
was that. Wow. That's what a story, eh? Like, oh my goodness.
yeah, and that really, like, I already knew life was short, but that was a full-on affirmation that life is short. And I had a brand new baby in the mix. It's one thing when you're older or you're single and you're just answering for yourself, but I had this newborn life that I was now responsible for, and my entire perspective on time changed, and how I exchange my time for money, that perspective changed. So she was my why. I really wanted to take control back of my time. Why? Because I wanted to be there for my child, because I didn't know how much time I really had on my hands, and I was going to spend it on my terms.
That's incredible. So really, you've been able to get that clarity around how important time is for you because you were working for someone else. How did real estate factor in to allow you to get more of your time back? And what was that transition like out of the corporate world into having more time freedom?
Well, so of course I'm married, and I like to call him Mr. No affectionately. In reality, his initials spell NO. Oliver is his name, but he is Mr. No. So when I would say, I think we need to find a different approach to our future, that we can't just rely on our job incomes and this grind. We need to find a different way. And I suggested real estate because I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and I had these ideas. He said, "You're nuts. We don't know anything about real estate. It's very unpredictable. We don't have the money. We have a brand new baby, and you wanted a Peg Perego stroller, which costs $1,200. What are you thinking?" You just don't
We have a City Select stroller, so I can attest to that. But go on. And the Veer wagon.
um, Actually, I should say, I think he shot me down. He said no to the Peg Brago. I think I ended up getting a Phil and Ted's for
Okay.
$700. We compromised. Who knew
Wow, that's a
strollers
good
were that
compromise.
expensive?
I know they are.
So he basically said, listen, the way the lifestyle that you want doesn't really lend itself too well, because we were spending money. We were making great money. We both had corporate jobs with great incomes and a great lifestyle, but that's really what it was, money in, money out. And although that was great for the time being, I also saw that, what, I need something that is going to give me control of my time and give me a little bit more security. So I needed to replace my paycheck. And I thought real estate was going to be the way to do that. But the rent that was going to be coming in to create that cash flow to offset a paycheck didn't seem like it was going to work, because I started going to meetups and learning from other people. And I'm not a math person. I'll be the first person to say math is not my strong suit. But I was able to put, one and two together to know that, most properties don't really cash flow. And then on top
Oh.
of that, you have tenants and toilets issues, and a clogged toilet is a call to a plumber. That's $180 out of your cash flow, and you were only cash flowing $150. Now you're in the
Right.
red for $30.
Right.
So I'm like, "Ugh, there's got to be another way." So I kept searching and searching and pushing. And this is all while I'm working, full time, because at that time I was still in my full time commitment. I went back after mat leave and I was attending meetups, and I finally, heard an opportunity to attend a rich dad event, those weekend events that they used
Yeah,
to do
love
way back
those.
when.
Yeah.
And it was free. So Mr. No
Yes.
can't say to this. He can't say no to this because it's free. All he has to do is agree to have the baby with the in-laws, and we are golden. So we attended that event, and that opened up his world. So part of it was me opening up my lens broader, and then bringing my husband into it so that he could also open up his perspective. Because it's one thing for me to try to like beat it over his head that real estate is the way to go. I just don't know how. Not a lot of credibility there. It's not very convincing. It's like, honey, I
Yeah.
know this is the way to go, but I just don't really know why.
Yeah. Just by
So
my
I brought
excitement. It's all good. Yeah. Yeah.
uh, brought him to this event, and he listened and he leaned in. And that's where we learned about the whole idea of lease options, because the trainers were, of course, out of the US and they called it lease options, but really what it was rent to own. And that changed my entire outlook on what real estate could mean, what cash flow could look like, and what it would look like to do real estate investing with a bigger purpose than just my own satisfying my own cash flow needs.
There's a lot to unpack there. So you went through a journey, you got your husband on board, Mr. No. So they were able to get him involved in an event to educate on rent to own, which was lease options at the time. And you realized also with traditional renting, maybe single family, it didn't really add up. Like you'd have to have 400 doors at, $50. And like you said, if you had a $3,000 repair, there goes a certain amount. So when we look at some rent to own right now, there's always people have hesitations. First of all, what is rent to own? That's for people who don't know what rent to own is. What is it on a high level? And then what are some things that you talk about in a rent to own webinar that you can highlight for us?
Mhm. So a lot of investors, when they think about rent to own, I think they approach it from the lens of a property. And I just want to caution people with rent to own, it's a unique strategy because in my view, it really starts with the people. It is the one strategy in real estate investing that's truly solving a problem for another family. And that problem generally is that they can't qualify for a mortgage because they might have, some blemishes on their credit after a divorce, or maybe they're new to the country, they don't have job history, or maybe they were a stay-at-home parent and the GDS, TDS isn't quite there. Maybe they have student loans. There's a whole bunch of reasons why their credit is imperfect. They're not deadbeats by any means, but they just have some challenges in making, checking all the boxes that the banks require us to check, because banks are not getting any more lenient. And on top of that, they've been trying to save up a bigger down payment, but it's difficult because they're renting and they have, household responsibilities and maybe kids and daycare, all of that. And the higher cost of living is not making it any easier. I've been doing this for 15 years, and there has always been a challenge to get into home ownership, no matter what the interest rates are, no matter how cheap or not cheap the houses are. There's always a personal circumstance, and that's really what we're solving for. Rent to own is a way of helping another family overcome their barriers to getting into home ownership. So today they can't get in with the banks, but if they rent to own, the rent to own process will help them fix the problems that they're facing. So build up a bigger down payment, improve their credit, pay down debt, get better at managing their money, whatever their circumstances are. That 3 or 4 year rent to own window will help that family become mortgage ready, so that ultimately they purchase that home that they've been renting to own at a pre-negotiated purchase price, which is higher than what the investor would buy it for today. So there's an appreciation component. So the investor earns a capital gain. And then because the goal is to help a family save up a bigger down payment, they're also paying kind of monthly down payment installments. And those monthly down payment installments are also known as credits towards the future purchase price. So those credits actually translate into cash flow for the investor. So the investor is basically selling a property at a future date at a pre-negotiated price, and they're selling it kind of in increments. And the other main distinction with rent to own for an investor is that the home buyers that are entering this arrangement aren't coming into the deal with just first and last month's rent. They're coming in with $30,000, $40,000 of the down payment money that they've scraped together. It's just not enough for them to get a mortgage because their credit isn't perfect, but it's enough for them to do rent to own. And then each month they add to that 30 or 40,000 initial down payment. So by the end of the rent to own process, that family will save, $60,000, $70,000 towards the purchase of the home. Their credit will be improved, and they had a sense of stability while they're living in a home for that timeline. So there's a lot of moving parts. It is a complicated strategy, but it starts with helping people overcome their barriers to getting qualified with the banks today.
Okay, excellent. So really helping them remove their barriers, like you said, pay a pre-negotiated sales price in 3 years. Credits that go towards owning or also help the cash flow of the investor. I've heard some of people saying, for example, well, they don't qualify now. What do you do to make sure that they're going to qualify in 3 years? What if they don't? And what do you put in place in your company if someone's interested in investing in rent to own? What do you do to help and make sure that that's going to be in place? And how does that all work, those moving parts?
So this is a very complicated strategy because you're dealing with a kind of balancing dynamics of what's happening today in their situation and where are they going to be in 3 years or 4 years at the end of that rent to own term. And we have to operate from where they're going. So we basically say, this is where we need them to be because this is how much they're going to be buying the house for. This is how much of a down payment credit they need to have. So what do they have today and what is the delta? And then we structure the rent to own to get to the finish line.
Okay, so you look at the delta. You also look at maybe credit repair tactics, et cetera, or whatnot. And then you make sure that you help them get to the delta. Do you ever extend that time period to get to the delta if the delta is bigger?
Yeah, that's part two of your question.
Oh,
So,
wow. Okay.
absolutely. That's really that built in mechanism to make sure that we help that family reach the goal and hit that finish line effectively. Life happens, there's turbulence in the real estate market, there's changes in the mortgage world. We can never predict, COVID was a huge disruptor for everybody
Yeah.
worldwide. So, nothing is set in stone. That I know for sure.
Mhm.
So we see about 20% of our tenant buyers needing an extension. And we're totally okay with that because as an investor who's holding title on this property, you still have someone who's motivated to own. They're paying faithfully because if they don't, and they're in breach of the contract, they lose all of those down payment installments that they put towards the purchase. So there's a serious carrot over that home buyer's head. But if they need an extension, they're motivated to keep on paying. What that really means is that I'm getting more mortgage pay down for an extended period of time. And then now I'm not selling that house to them at year 4. I'm selling that house to them at year 5, which means that I'm adding a little bit more on the purchase price. So I'm getting a bigger capital gain as well. So extensions are really a win-win strategy to help that 20% that can't quite exit the deal at the pre-negotiated timeline.
So it seems like in the agreement you have that all written out as well as the extension percentage or appreciation, if you will, if they don't reach the goal. And do you have like a risk assessment? Like, okay, this tenant is going to be probably going to be able to hit the finish line based on their situation, based on their just their general, and then there may be some tenants that are not ready yet to do rent to own. Like, how does that work, you think?
There's a lot of extensive screening that happens to actually get to an RTO deal. To be honest, rent to own is absolutely not for everyone. Just because someone can't qualify for a mortgage does not make them a good candidate for rent to own because they might not have the income to afford the type of property that they want to own, and they might have zero money saved up for a down payment. And I think there's a big misnomer. A lot of people think rent to own solves for inaffordability or, having no job. And that's a big That's a big misnomer. That's one of the reasons why we wrote a book to educate people about the ins and outs of rent to own. But the reality is, we have to screen a lot of people to be able to find the ones that qualify. And then the ones that qualify have to be educated on how the rent to own process is going to help their unique situation. Because rent to own is not a one size fits all. You have to really customize the process for each individual family's challenges because the barriers are unique. So once you create a customized solution, that family still has to take it or leave it. And remember, you're dealing with, first time home buyers in many cases, and first time home buyers are very emotional. And in some cases, they're a little bit naive about how real estate works and where the true risks are. They might be overthinking or overanalyzing and kind of standing in their own way. So there's a lot of screening and educating and hand holding that needs to happen. And then finally, they can hit the streets and go house hunting. So we start with the people, qualify them first, educate them. And then when they're ready, and they truly have to be ready, they go house hunting with a real estate agent. So they get to, shop the market and experience those butterflies for the property that's the one. And that's really the goal, is for them to be able to find a property that they are emotionally connected to, that they can see their family in for years to come, that they, this is going to be home. And that sense of security creates a very strong emotional commitment to the rent to own arrangement.
That's incredible. I know you mentioned why you got into this as well. What also makes your company a little bit different? I know in the website, I think there was a really good explanation. There's a lot of rent own companies out there. What do you think are some of the things that make Clover Properties a little bit different in helping these people realize home ownership?
I love that question, Sam. I don't get asked that question very often. I think the number one thing that makes us different is that we're really just families helping families. Behind the scenes of every rent to own deal is a family just like Neil's and mine. I wish I could help every family. We've helped over 800 families, by the way, and continue, we're on track to do 1,000 rent to own deals. And
Oh,
Neil and I can't possibly take on all those mortgages ourselves. We hit the brick wall at the very beginning. And that's actually what got us to start talking to friends and family to see if they could step in to take on some of these mortgages, where we matched a home buyer that we screened for rent to own and paired them with a family member or a friend who was able to take on a mortgage. And that spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. And we have a pretty significant network now of families who want to help other families get into home ownership and overcome these barriers, because we as families understand the importance of setting roots in a community, having a place where your kids can call home. And those values is really what drives our rent to own deals. It's not about just the profits, it's really about the people. I think that is
yeah,
probably the
that's
biggest
great.
differentiator for us.
So those values of community and giving back, it seems like those really drive the business, and they've also driven you to have an impact with other people that have been other families helping other families. Is that right?
Exactly. There's just so much opportunity to help, because each investor also is on their own journey, and they at different times of their journey need, cash flow boost. So this strategy helps them, not just in the sense of giving them a sense of security and stability that they're dealing with someone with home ownership mentality in their property and someone who is committed to looking after it. Because as you know, Sam, in a rent to own, the family that's renting to own is handling maintenance and repairs. That falls on them. Whereas if you just have a straight out rental, the tenants are careless and they don't have the same pride of ownership. And for many investors, that's heartbreaking, that you worked really hard to buy this property, and the people occupying it, treat it with disrespect and create damage, costly damage. With rent to owns, it's the opposite. You have a family who's super grateful to this other family that's buying this house, enabling this rent to own transaction to happen, and they're doing everything that they can to appease the investor that's on title, because they're so grateful for that family to give this rent to own family an opportunity at home ownership.
That's fantastic. It definitely creates a lot of opportunity for someone. Now, let's say speaking about we'll talk about the investor first. If someone's investing in rent to own with you in your company, what are some things they need to do to get started? And when I looked at a rent to own worksheet, for example, I remember seeing it showed the rates the rates were different, and it showed a different percentage or different monthly cash flow. I know you're not able to give an exact answer. However, what can someone expect when they're investing in rent to own as far as like maybe return, or and can they also, if they have a property that's really in the negative, can they create that tenant to be rent to own to get out of that negative cash flow?
Mm-hmm. Lots of good questions in there. So, as far as rates go, a professional rent to own company should have their hand on the pulse, and they're constantly, pivoting and adjusting the framework of the rent to own arrangement so that it is in line with where we are in terms of financing, in terms of affordability, in terms of the stress test. There's a lot of moving parts, and we're constantly adapting. So, in today's world, we're dealing with a just over 6% interest rate
Yep.
on some of our
Yep.
deals.
Yep.
But we are able to adjust our rent to own structure so that the tenant buyers that we're bringing in, they're also impacted by higher interest rates as well. And of course, they still have to pass the stress test on the back end. So all of those dynamics allow us to work the numbers in a way that makes rent to owns still deliver, for us, we're still seeing about $800 a month
Okay,
in
good.
cash flow.
Yeah, because I saw like an example where there was a managing partner. So maybe it's yourself who screens the tenant buyers. Because, for example, if I'm investing in rent to own, I wouldn't be able to do the screening of the tenant. That's just not my thing, right? So you kind of come in as I guess, is it a managing partner? You help with getting the tenant, structuring that as part of, and then let's say we're the money partner in that partnership, and we bring the funds to be able to qualify for the property to help this family. Is that right?
So that's one way of structuring rent to own
Okay.
in a partnership capacity. So
Okay.
that's, I guess, back to your question previously about what makes Clover Properties unique. One of the other factors is that we actually don't partner on the deals. Not
Okay.
everybody wants to have partners. We have a lot of investors that
Yep.
have, 4 or 5 rent to own deals, and they don't necessarily want to be tied down in a partnership capacity, which I completely
Yep.
respect. So we bring our services to the table on a fee for service basis. So the investor that takes title, we do all the screening and the vetting and the
Right.
calculating and the contract organizing. We do all of that for a flat fee. And then the investor is the beneficiary of all the cash flow and all the profits. And profits right now, I mean, we're still seeing, even with a high interest rate environment, profits are usually well into, the low 20, 22, 23% per year on investment. And I actually just used a HELOC on one of my deals where I used, my initial down payment, that 20% on the property came from a HELOC. And HELOCs are right now at 7.2% interest rate. So
Mhm.
I've got six-ish on my mortgage and I got 7.2 on my HELOC. And I'm still cash flowing about $480 a month and
Mm.
about 21% return on investment per year on that deal. And remember, with rent owns, we're also dealing with entry level buyers. So we're not buying, $2 million homes or $1 million
Yeah.
homes. We're
Yeah.
buying entry level homes, and that's, five to $700,000
Mhm.
price range. So our borrowing power also goes further as well.
So it seems like a lower barrier to entry. You have better cash flow, so it could be even $800 potentially in
Mhm.
this market. That seems like it's actually works out really well for the investor. Are there anything else that they should know about in that example as well, with someone who has a property right now and it's in a very high like negative cash flow? Can they get these people to potentially qualify to rent to own, and can they convert them to a rent to own
That's
situation?
a really great question. And we definitely try to help investors look at that possibility. I wouldn't recommend, if someone doesn't have any background or understanding of how rent to own works, I wouldn't recommend that they try to figure this out on their own.
Absolutely not.
I'm happy to take those calls and
Yeah.
guide them. The key there is, although you have a property that's in the red, you still have to marry someone else's affordability with that. So if that property is in a higher price point, say the fair market value today on that property that's in the red is around $700,000, well, you're going to need to have a family that has a higher household income to be able to not just keep up with the monthly payments, but remember, the goal is to get that family to take ownership of that property and qualify under the stress test. So your buyer pool tends to shrink if the property is in a higher price point because you need, there's
Right.
fewer people that have
I see.
$150,000 combined household income, especially if they're first time home buyers. Plus, on top of that, there's a temptation to waive that initial down payment from the home buyer that would be applying to rent to own. And I caution every investor out there never to waive an initial down payment. That initial down payment is so important because zero down payment rent to owns flop, and it's a big risk. There's not enough skin in the game. And on top of that, it doesn't allow those rent to owners to save up a down payment through the rent to own process. If you leave those rent to owners to their own devices, they are not going to know how to help themselves. They're in the situation for a reason. And if they don't get enough of that structure, they will not be able to exit as planned, and the investor will not necessarily get the desired outcome. So that's where things can get really topsy-turvy. So although you're in the red and you have this property, the temptation is to help any Tom, Dick, and Harry move in and rent to own it, or an existing tenant just rent to own it.
Yeah.
It's not that easy. You have to make sure that the income is there and it's in line with the fair market value of that property. And you also have to make sure that those rent to owners have at least 3 to 4% minimum down payment. So on a $700,000 property, we'd want to see at least $30,000 down, 35, the more the better. That's the rule of thumb.
Okay, excellent. So really it seems like it's a lower barrier to entry as far as the purchase price. If someone owns a home already or a property that's in the red, they may not have the down payment, and also that property might be more expensive. So it's better to get into something like getting them into a home and vetting that tenant. Now, do you have a lot of tenant buyers, or do you find the investor first? And how does the people that you have in your network play into the rent to own strategy if you don't partner with them? Just curious.
So one investor
Mhm.
can do, 3 or 4 rent owns. So they can help multiple families in the same year, because us as investors, we have, higher net worth. So we have more capacity to borrow. And as you do more rent owns, you tend to have more capacity to borrow in some cases.
Right.
So the home buyer side really drives rent to own deals. So we always need to have, of course, more home buyers so that we can satisfy the appetite for the investor side.
Are you finding that there's an appetite for home buying if the rent to own is there's a benefit, yet there's a more of a monthly amount and there's more commitment? Are you finding that the tenant buyers are still willing to come to the table and say, I'm willing to pay more and put it to this pot so I can have the home at the end?
Well, absolutely. I think it goes back to that home buyer's why as well. Do they want to continue putting $3,000 into their rental? And I just did the math. After 4 years, they would have spent I don't know, $150,000 on rent. That's
150,000. I never did that math. Wow. That's a lot.
and kudos to the landlords that are keeping those renters and getting that kind of money. But if a renter has the why of not putting that money into rent and wants to become an owner, their options are to save up on the side on their own. And most people are going to have a harder time being disciplined to save up, $600, $700, $800 a month towards a bigger down payment. And in the process, prices keep going up. So by the time they do save up more, well, that 5% is not even going to be 5%. And then on top of that, you have closing costs and then you have legal costs.
Yeah.
And before you know it, you're still $10,000, $15,000 short every single time. So rent to own basically stops that circuit and says, okay, let's get you into a system, a process where it's automated for you. You make the income. We're just going to funnel it in a way that's going to serve you while you live in a home that gives you that sense of ownership and that sense of security and stability. And, if that resonates with their why wouldn't they want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Rent to own is not really about paying more for the property.
Yeah.
Rent to own is really about two payments. There's the rent, which you're going to pay anyway.
Yep.
But in this case, you also have the forced savings component
Yep.
so that you can have the option to buy this property. And that extra $700, you would have to save it up on your own anyway. Rent to own just kind of does it for you in a more consistent way so that you achieve your target.
It's like giving them a hand up with, and also showing them that because they're willing to commit a little bit and go through a process that shows they're serious, then the investor's willing to give a little bit, and there's a win-win for everybody. It
That's
seems.
exactly how it works.
So if someone's getting started in investing in rent to own, two quick things, and it's kind of a selfish question too. It's interesting. If you had a property that's negative cash flow, would you be opted to maybe sell that property and invest in rent to own? Should you consider that? And yeah, how does that work? If you can share that a little bit, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really great question. I think the first thing that I would do is I would assess the viability of finding a tenant buyer that could rent to own that property. And the chances of finding a quality tenant buyer are higher if the property fair market value is lower.
Okay.
So the lower the fair market value of that property, the bigger the prospect pool. And who knows, maybe we have some contacts in our database that are looking for a property in a particular area and a particular price point, so we can help match that tenant buyer. So I would exhaust that angle first, because if you already have some mortgage pay down, and if you already have well, maybe you don't have a decent rate. So that's another consideration. If you're locked into a first and second and you were paying exuberant interest rates, then that would be probably the driver for me to want to sell, to get out of a less favorable financing situation. Because like anything else with real estate investing, the lower cost of borrowing, the higher your profitability. So if you're stuck in a property that doesn't have a favorable interest rate, or it doesn't have favorable terms, then a rent to own probably won't salvage the issue,
Hmm.
in which case it would be better off to sell. And I'll tell you, if it's in that kind of entry level price range of 5 to 7 to 800,000, we're seeing bidding wars continuously.
Yeah, I
I'm
was just
sure
gonna
you
say,
can
because
attest
our average price, let's say, is around 860 in Waterloo Region, Kitchener, and we help a lot of people getting into the market and also upsizing. But in your opinion, if the property was, let's say, 750, would, if that tenant is already on an actual lease, would you look at the option of that investor potentially selling and then looking at a rent to own instead to help their buying power, because maybe it'll help their name and their buying power? Or would it be interesting to see if that tenant can actually apply for to be a rent to own, or would that not be recommended? Just curious.
that. That's a really great question. To be honest, Sam, I would start with the first question in terms of what are the carrying costs? Am I
Right.
am I getting a decent rate on this property? What will it cost each month to the tenant buyer to be able to cover my carrying costs? And is it in line with what they would be paying if they were just renting? Or is it much higher? Because you still have to be competitive on the rent part in a rent to own. You can't jack up the rent just because it's a rent to own. You still have to be kind of, where the market is averaging. So that's part one. And then part two, does the tenant buyer have the income to support that amount each month to pay my carrying costs? And do they have enough income to be able to afford a little bit of a down payment savings? So what is the income situation with that tenant buyer? And then do they have a down payment component? So first assess the investor's financing, kind of take inventory of that, and then look at the tenant profile and see where they're at in terms of income and down payment. Those three things have to kind of align first and foremost. And when they do, that's when you would broach the topic of, hey, tenant buyer, would you like to rent to own this property? I'll give you whatever. I'll give you a chance to buy it over the course of a 3 or a 4 year term. And then another popular question is, well, how do you know whether it should be a 3 year term or a 4 year term? Well, that's where you have to work the numbers with a professional
Delta.
to make sure that the tenant buyer will have enough runway to become mortgage ready. And that's where most investors fall short in their skills and their knowledge, and you want to basically, work with a rent-to-own company that
Agreed.
can help guide you on that. But yes, I mean, exhaust those avenues first. And if there isn't a good fit with the tenant that is currently there in terms of income or down payment, then can try putting up ads that this home is available for rent to own, and be very transparent about what the monthly payment is going to look like when you factor in the rent and you factor in the down payment credit, assuming that the tenant buyer would be coming in with at least 4 or 5% at the beginning. And if there's no takers, then obviously selling would make much more sense.
Okay, excellent. Now, your services that you do, are they on a success basis, or is it like, sort, let's say you have a complimentary call with an investor, you determine that, okay, we think we can help you, and then you go ahead with a plan. What is needed from the investor to kind of get an assessment on the solution for their situation and maybe their cash flow goals? Maybe do you work with a lot of investors that say, I would like to have a certain amount of passive income. How can you help me get there?
Mm-hmm. So are we talking about investors who are just starting out, or an investor who already has a property that might be in the red?
We could switch gears. So instead of a property that's in the red, because I think that that's definitely another conversation, but also potentially on your, yeah, so an investor starting out, someone who is looking at your services and said, okay, I see a lot of value in this. I'm not sure if I'm able to just invest whatever the services are if I don't know if it's going to work for me based on my situation, financial, whatever. What do you do to assess that and how see how they move through it, and then decide if it's worth it for them to work with your services, and then a fee based or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the first question is always, what are you trying to accomplish? Is this something that has a cash flow objective for you? Or in some cases, people are looking just to rapidly grow their capital because, in a rent to own deal, I can put in $100,000 into an RTO, and fast forward 4 years later, I now have, another $100,000 in profit, and I didn't have to lift a finger. It was completely passive, turnkey. So I get my original 100 back, and I have another profit of 100,000. And that 100,000 came to me partially in cash flow and partially through the capital gain. So some people really like kind of the ability to double their money quickly, especially when there's a HELOC component. They like the fact that they can still cash flow by using their HELOC and making money on the bank's money. I mean, it's a no-brainer. You can't really do that with a BRRRR. You can't really do that with, a duplex in some cases, especially if there's a renovation component to it. You buy the property, you're not cash flowing for the first 3 to 4, 6 months, however
Yep.
long your renos take. God knows renos are unpredictable.
Landlines. Yep.
So somebody wants to cash flow from day one and they want to use their HELOC money in the process, rent to own will make sense for them. And these are the kinds of conversations we're having. What are you looking to get
Right.
out of this?
Okay.
And
Got
then
it.
the next question, of course, is qualifying. Can you qualify for a mortgage? Because as we talked earlier, I am not looking to work with you in a partnership capacity. I want you to own the asset fully because it's going to add to your net worth. It's going to give you more security and stability, and it's going to maximize your profitability. And that's really what I'm trying to accomplish. And that leads us naturally into what can you qualify for, what kind of interest rates, and then we start crunching some numbers.
Okay. So it seems like a case by case basis. You mentioned something really interesting, doubling your money. Like, so in that situation with $100,000 profit, as well as, one through cash flow and gain, does that investor have to qualify for the entire mortgage? So let's say the property is 500,000 or 550,000. They have to have the down payment and qualify for that amount. Do you have a mortgage broker then that they vet with to see, okay, you're going to qualify for this? Let's have a further discussion around our services. How does that work?
Absolutely. It would be the same way as if you were buying any other type of
Mm-hmm.
property. You'd have an initial conversation with a broker or the bank, whoever you work with normally, and they will give you an idea of what's possible when it comes to an investment property. Because at the end of the day, whether you're buying a rent to own or you're buying a regular single family rental, they're still an investment property, and you're going to be
Yeah.
qualified under those borrowing parameters.
Excellent. So it seems like definitely if do you have a lot of people, investors come to you and friends and family and say, I would like to, and I talked this the other day with the Tony Robbins thing where it's like financial security, then you have, financial independence. Do you find that this allows them to get further ahead because rather than just, you said one or two doors, there's renovations, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot more work versus rent to own seems like you're investing in real estate, you're helping families, but you're also helping cash flow. It also helps your income replacing your job as well, right? Is that fair to say?
Mhm. Yeah, rent to own is an interesting one because, as you know, real estate is all about time in the market, not timing the market. So the
Absolutely.
longer you own an asset, the more you have mortgage pay down, the more it appreciates year over year, even using conservative, 5% annualized, the longer you hold it, the better. But the problem is you're deferring cash flow for, a good 5, 7, 10 years, right?
Yes.
Until you
Yes.
paid down enough mortgage to create that cash flow. So I'm impatient. I am one of those impatient investors, and my
Good.
lifestyle didn't lend itself well to dealing
Right.
with tenants, toilets, and trash. So for me, rent to own satisfied my goals at a certain point in my life. And that cash flow play was really, really important. I don't think it's the only strategy for real estate investing. I do believe that you should have kind of a high cash flow strategy in your portfolio to offset, turbulent times. But I do believe you should also have things that build wealth for the long term. So I actually used my rent to own investing strategy really helped address what I needed to address while my kids were younger and I needed to replace a six-figure corporate income
Right.
to sustain, a lifestyle, and kids are very expensive.
Is your wagon? Exactly. My wife is
Exactly.
listening to this. It's expensive. I'm just joking.
They are expensive.
Yeah.
So the cash flow with rent to own and the rapid profits with rent to own, that midterm investing strategy really supported me through those times. And I will continue to be investing in rent to owns because I mean, there's just no reason to stop, and more people need these services as well. But at the same point, I'm now using some of the money that I've, earned through these rent to owns and channeling them into other strategies. And that's where the multifamily space opens
Right.
up for me. Multifamily wasn't even on my radar 5 years ago
Right.
because I
Right.
was in a different place as an investor. Now I'm in a different place. And now I'm
Right.
like, oh, rent to own. Plus, okay, fine, I'll
Right.
start to deal with tenants, toilets, and trash because, well, I have more
Yeah.
capacity for it. Have
Yeah, it seems
more.
like you have more capital preservation there and you have the cash flow. You've been in the game. You've been able to help people and help a lot of families and then generate that. You have the business as well. And now you can start focusing on the other stuff. So that's absolutely fantastic. So tell me a little bit about your book. You have the book that you wrote. What's that about? Why is that potentially important for someone to read and check out? What are they going to get out of that?
You're talking about the rent
Financial
to own
guide for
essential
home buyers.
guide
Yes, love it.
for home buyers.
Okay.
So we wrote this book. My husband and I wrote this book out of necessity because our phone was ringing off the hook. When people got a feeling for, oh, there's this family that helps other families rent to own, we got inundated with phone calls from not just people who are interested in doing rent to own, but people who were in rent to own arrangements that were written on the back of a paper napkin with sketchy terms and misspelled names
Yeah,
and
it's
weird calculations. And then they would call us and say, I'm in this rent to own, and these are the terms, and this is what the landlord wants. And I don't know if this is fair. Can you help me? Can you salvage my deal? I'm losing money, I'm losing my home. What can you do? And that didn't happen just once, that didn't happen twice. That we were getting probably in a month, we were getting about 10 phone calls
wow.
from people that were in rent to owns that were going sideways. And unfortunately, we could not help very many of them. So we thought, okay, well, how can we change this in the future? We can't control how other people did their rent owns, but we can provide a tool to help families access resources so that they can make more informed decisions. So that's where the rent own essential guide for home buyers really came from. We wanted to create a resource to help home buyers access, a $20 book on Amazon that breaks down the good, the bad, the ugly, and then some about rent to own so that they don't aren't put into a position of, oh, I didn't know that.
Right. Everything, it's
And
like a rent to own Bible, pretty much everything you need to know about rent to own as a home buyer.
exactly. Exactly. And a lot of people ask, well, why didn't you write a book for the investor side? Well, investors are super savvy and investors know how to research things, and investors have
Yeah,
pretty
resourceful.
rich networks.
Yeah.
They can get to the heart of the answers in a much quicker. Whereas these home buyers, some of them are going through some sort of a personal
Mhm.
setback. They don't necessarily have friends and family who are supportive of them getting into home ownership. So they have
Right.
no one to lean on and guide them. And they're just trying to break away from redundant circumstances that aren't helping them get ahead, and they didn't really have anyone they could call or anyone they could talk to. I said, you know what, a $20 book on Amazon could make a huge difference for some of these people. And truly it did shoot down us receiving a lot of those phone calls about failed rent to owns.
So it seemed like the book was born out of all the questions to help with like an FAQs and an essential guide and what other companies are not doing right, I guess, right? There's a lot of wrong ways to do it, which I'd like to hear one or how rent to own, like what are some common objections and what are some things that you do to handle those common objections with rent to own, like, and other companies may not be doing it at the same level. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're still dealing with home buyer mentality, and it's the usual suspects. I don't know that rent to own is dealing with anything too unusual. It's more about, should I sit and wait for prices to drop? Should I sit and wait for interest rates to drop?
Yeah, my
Um,
my cousin at the barbecue told me blah blah blah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
exactly. I hear prices are at an all-time high and they have no choice but to come down. And many of them don't even understand what the stress test is. They're like, well, what's the stress test that I have to be aware of? So, and I think another hurdle is that their expectation of what their income truly buys them compared to what the bank will approve them for, there is a big discrepancy. And many of them get disappointed that, I have a beer budget, but I want to own a property that the price of champagne.
Yeah, yeah.
We're like, level out your
Yeah.
expectation. This is not a dream home. This
Yeah,
is,
it's the first step to the next home. I totally agree with you. I tell the people that all the time. Like got to set those expectations, right? Because and also that Jones's mentality, like let's get in so you can build and grow, right? So I think that's really important.
yeah, you got to take the first step rather than, leap to the top of the staircase.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're right about investors too. Like I remember Dan Sullivan was talking about entrepreneurs or investors, like they take things of lower value and make them higher value. And that's what you talked about, right? You take in the bank's money, you're figuring out a way to make more money and add more value. So now you're creating a profit from that. So I think it's amazing. So where can people find you? We're going to have information. Do you have a digital copy of that book at all? I mean, like I would be happy to purchase it and support. Yeah, it seems like a great book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So the book is, yeah, it's available on amazon.ca. For a digital copy, they would have to reach out to me, and I can be reached at Rachel at rethinkrenting.com.
Okay, perfect. So we'll make sure that we have that in the show notes. Rachel, it's been so informative. Like, probably could dive a million times deeper. We'll probably have you on again. I really appreciate your time. It's been great talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much.